What started as routine promotion turned into television's most explosive confrontation when Dakota Johnson called out Jimmy Kimmel's inappropriate behavior, leading to a dramatic walkout that has the entire industry talking. The studio lights dimmed as Jimmy Kimmel Live prepared for what producers believed would be another standard celebrity interview. Dakota Johnson, fresh from her latest film premiere, sat across from Kimmel in the familiar late-night talk show setup. The audience buzzed with anticipation, unaware they were about to witness one of the most uncomfortable moments in television history. Kimmel opened with his typical monologue energy, but something felt different tonight. His usual comedic timing seemed forced, his smile more strained than genuine. As he introduced Johnson, there was an underlying tension that seasoned viewers might have detected, though most attributed it to the typical pre-interview jitters that even experienced hosts sometimes experience. "So Dakota, you've been making headlines lately, and not just for your movies," Kimmel began, his tone carrying an edge that immediately put Johnson on alert. She shifted slightly in her chair, her media-trained smile faltering for just a moment, before she composed herself. "I'm here to talk about my film, Jimmy," Johnson replied diplomatically, though her voice carried a warning that Kimmel either didn't catch or chose to ignore entirely. The audience sensed the shift in atmosphere. What should have been lighthearted banter felt more like a chess match, with each participant carefully calculating their next move. Kimmel leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the power in the room. "Come on. You know that's not what people want to hear about," Kimmel pressed, his voice taking on a condescending tone that made several audience members visibly uncomfortable. "Let's talk about your personal life. Your dating history has been quite the topic of conversation lately." Johnson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Years of Hollywood interviews had taught her to navigate inappropriate questions with grace, but there was something particularly aggressive about Kimmel's approach tonight that felt different from the usual invasive celebrity journalism. "I think my personal relationships are exactly that. Personal," she responded firmly, her publicist shifting nervously in the wings as they recognized the warning signs of an interview going off the rails. Kimmel chuckled, but it wasn't the warm laugh his audience was accustomed to. It was cold, dismissive, and carried an undertone of mockery that seemed to surprise even his own production team. Several crew members exchanged concerned glances as they watched their usually professional host push boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. "Oh, come on, Dakota. You're in Hollywood. Privacy is a luxury you gave up when you signed your first contract," Kimmel said, his words dripping with a cynicism that revealed more about his own worldview than hers. "Besides, your fans want to know. They feel like they know you." The comment struck a nerve that Johnson had been carefully protecting throughout her career. She had always been vocal about maintaining boundaries between her public and private life, and Kimmel's dismissive attitude toward that principle felt like a personal attack on her values and autonomy. "My fans respect my boundaries because I've been clear about them," Johnson shot back, her voice rising slightly as her composure began to crack. "Unlike some people in this industry who seem to think that fame gives them the right to invade every aspect of someone's personal life." The studio fell silent except for the hum of cameras still rolling. Kimmel's smile faltered for the first time since the interview began, clearly not expecting Johnson to push back with such directness. His usual tactics of charming deflection weren't working, and the audience could sense his frustration building. "Well, that's an interesting perspective from someone who's built their career on being in the public eye," Kimmel replied, his tone now openly hostile. "You can't have it both ways, Dakota. You can't take the benefits of fame and then complain when people are interested in your life." Johnson's eyes flashed with anger that she no longer tried to hide. The careful media training that had guided her through countless interviews was being overwhelmed by her genuine indignation at Kimmel's attitude and his apparent belief that celebrity status stripped away basic human dignity. "Actually, Jimmy, I can have it exactly the way I want it," she said, her voice steady but filled with steel. And what I want is to be treated with the same respect that any human being deserves, regardless of their profession. The tension in the room was now palpable, with audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they witnessed what felt more like a confrontation than an interview. Kimmel's face reddened slightly, clearly unused to being challenged so directly on his own show, in front of his own audience, with his own cameras capturing every uncomfortable moment. Kimmel's producer frantically gestured from behind the cameras, trying to signal for a commercial break, but the host was too focused on reasserting his dominance to notice. His ego, bruised by Johnson's refusal to play along with his inappropriate line of questioning, drove him to double down on his aggressive approach. "Look, Dakota, I've been doing this for years," Kimmel said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made the air in the studio feel thick with hostility. "I know what works in television, and what works is honesty. Raw, unfiltered honesty. Not this carefully crafted image your publicists have built for you." Johnson's composure finally cracked completely. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes blazing with a fury that had been building throughout the interview. The careful diplomacy she had maintained despite Kimmel's increasingly inappropriate behavior evaporated in an instant. "Unfiltered honesty?" she repeated, her voice rising to a level that made several audience members visibly flinch. "You want unfiltered honesty, Jimmy? Here's some honesty for you. You're a bully who hides behind comedy to justify treating people like garbage." The studio fell into a stunned silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Even the usually animated late-night audience sat frozen, unsure whether they should applaud, boo, or simply sit in shocked silence as they watched their beloved host being dismantled on live television. Kimmel's jaw dropped, his carefully constructed on-screen persona crumbling before the eyes of millions of viewers. He had built his career on being the likable everyman, the comedian who could poke fun at celebrities, while still maintaining their respect and friendship. Johnson's words cut through that facade like a knife. "Excuse me," Kimmel sputtered, his voice cracking slightly as he struggled to regain control of the situation. "I think you're overreacting here, Dakota. This is just how these interviews work. It's entertainment." "Entertainment?" Johnson shot back, standing up from her chair in a move that sent shockwaves through the production team. "Humiliating your guests is entertainment? Making women uncomfortable on national television is your idea of comedy?" The cameras continued, rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming the most explosive talk show moment in recent memory. Social media was already beginning to buzz as clips from the interview started appearing online, with viewers expressing their shock at Kimmel's behavior and their support for Johnson's bold response. Kimmel tried to salvage the situation with his trademark humor, but his usual charm felt hollow and desperate in the face of Johnson's righteous anger. "Come on, Dakota. You're being a little dramatic here. We're just having a conversation." "No, Jimmy, you're not having a conversation," Johnson replied, her voice now steady and controlled, which somehow made her words even more devastating. "You're interrogating me about my private life, dismissing my boundaries, and then acting like I'm the problem when I refuse to be your victim." The word victim hung in the air like a thunderclap. Audience members began whispering among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record what they sensed was becoming a historic moment in television. Kimmel's face went from red to pale as the full weight of the situation began to dawn on him. "I never said you were a victim," Kimmel protested weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he seemed to realize that his behavior had crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed, though his pride prevented him from acknowledging it directly. "You didn't have to say it," Johnson replied, her voice filled with a quiet strength that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Your entire approach tonight has been designed to make me feel small, to reduce me to nothing more than tabloid gossip and romantic speculation. That's not journalism, Jimmy. That's not even entertainment. It's just cruel." The production team scrambled behind the scenes, with assistants frantically trying to figure out how to handle a situation. that had spiraled completely out of their control. This wasn't supposed to happen. Celebrity interviews were supposed to be predictable, choreographed affairs where everyone played their assigned roles and nobody rocked the boat. But Johnson wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed energized by finally speaking her truth. After years of tolerating similar treatment from other hosts who mistook their platform for permission to be invasive and disrespectful. "You know what the real problem is, Jimmy?" Johnson continued, her voice carrying across the silent studio with crystal clarity. "You've gotten so comfortable treating women like objects for your entertainment that you can't even recognize when you're doing it anymore. This isn't the first time, is it?" Kimmel's eyes darted nervously toward his producers, silently pleading for someone to cut to commercial, but the damage was already done. Johnson's question hung in the air like an accusation that everyone in the room knew had merit. Whispers began circulating through the audience as people recalled other interviews where Kimmel had crossed similar lines. "I treat all my guests the same," Kimmel stammered. But even as the words left his mouth, he seemed to realize how unconvincing they sounded. His usual confident demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate flailing of someone who had finally been called out for behavior they had never expected to face consequences for. "Really?" Johnson challenged, taking a step closer to his desk in a move that made Kimmel visibly shrink back in his chair. "Because I've watched your show, Jimmy. I've seen how you interview men versus how you interview women. When was the last time you asked a male actor about his dating life? When was the last time you dismissed a man's request for privacy as unreasonable?" The question struck like lightning, illuminating the double standard that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Audience members began nodding in recognition, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding, as Johnson articulated what many had felt but never been able to put into words. Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had built his career on quick wit and clever comebacks, but faced with Johnson's systematic deconstruction of his interview tactics, he found himself speechless for perhaps the first time in his professional life. "That's what I thought," Johnson said, her voice filled with disgust, as she watched Kimmel struggle to formulate a response. "You can dish it out, but you can't take it when someone fights back." The cameramen continued filming, though several looked uncomfortable capturing what felt more like a public execution than an entertainment segment. The live audience had gone from uncomfortable shuffling to rapt attention, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Kimmel finally found his voice, but what emerged was defensive and petulant rather than the smooth recovery his audience expected. "Look, Dakota, I think you're taking this way too seriously. It's just a talk show. We're supposed to have fun here." "Fun?" Johnson repeated incredulously, her voice rising again as fresh anger surged through her. "Fun for who exactly? Because I can guarantee you that being grilled about my personal life, having my boundaries dismissed, and being told that fame means I don't deserve basic respect isn't fun for me." She gestured toward the audience, many of whom were now pulling out their phones to record the confrontation. "And judging by their faces, it's not fun for them either. So who exactly is this supposed to be entertaining, Jimmy? Just you?" The accusation hit its mark perfectly. Kimmel's face flushed red again as he realized that Johnson had exposed the fundamental selfishness of his approach. He had been so focused on creating what he thought was good television that he had completely ignored the human cost of his methods. His producer finally managed to catch his attention, frantically making cutting motions across their throat. But Kimmel's pride wouldn't let him back down gracefully. Instead of apologizing or attempting to de-escalate, he doubled down on his position with the desperation of someone who knew they were losing badly. "I'm just doing my job," Kimmel said weakly, his voice lacking any of the conviction that had characterized his earlier attacks. "This is what late-night television is supposed to be." "No, Jimmy," Johnson replied, her voice now carrying a finality that suggested the conversation was nearing its end. "This is what you've decided late-night television should be. You've normalized this behavior so thoroughly that you actually believe it's acceptable." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering what would become the most quoted line from the entire confrontation. "But just because you've gotten away with it before doesn't mean you get to keep getting away with it now." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usually restless live audience sat frozen, processing the weight of Johnson's words. This wasn't just about one uncomfortable interview anymore. It had become a reckoning with years of normalized inappropriate behavior that had been disguised as entertainment. Kimmel's face went through a series of expressions: anger, embarrassment, and finally, a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of his dignity. "I think we should probably take a commercial break," he said weakly, reaching for the safety net that had rescued him from countless awkward moments throughout his career. "No," Johnson said firmly, her voice cutting through his attempt to escape. "I'm done here." She began removing her microphone with deliberate, measured movements that somehow felt more dramatic than any scripted television moment. Each action was calculated to send a clear message. She was choosing to leave. This wasn't a tantrum or an emotional breakdown, but a conscious decision by someone who refused to tolerate disrespect any longer. "Dakota, come on," Kimmel pleaded, his voice taking on a wheedling quality that made him sound even more pathetic. "Let's just finish the interview. We can talk about your movie now." Johnson looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust that was somehow more cutting than her earlier anger. "Now you want to talk about my movie? After spending the entire interview trying to reduce me to gossip and speculation?" "It's too late for that, Jimmy." She stood up, smoothing down her dress with the kind of composed grace that only someone who had completely won a confrontation could manage. The audience began to murmur, some starting to applaud, others pulling out their phones to capture what they instinctively knew would become viral within hours. "You had your chance to conduct a respectful interview," Johnson continued, her voice carrying easily across the stunned studio. "Instead, you chose to be invasive, dismissive, and frankly, cruel. I won't sit here and pretend that's acceptable just to make good television." Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is really unprofessional, Dakota. We had an agreement." Johnson's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Unprofessional? You want to talk about unprofessional? Let's discuss how unprofessional it is to ambush a guest with inappropriate questions, to dismiss their clearly stated boundaries, and to act like basic human decency is somehow unreasonable." She picked up her purse from beside the chair, the simple action somehow carrying the weight of a final statement. "Our agreement was for a professional interview about my work. You broke that agreement the moment you decided my personal life was more interesting than my actual career." The production team had given up trying to salvage the situation. Cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what everyone in the room knew would become one of the most talked-about television moments in recent memory. Social media was already exploding with clips and commentary, with viewers overwhelmingly supporting Johnson's stance. "You know what's really sad, Jimmy?" Johnson said, pausing at the edge of the interview area. "You're actually a talented host when you want to be, but you've gotten so comfortable using your platform to make people uncomfortable that you've forgotten how to do anything else." Kimmel sat in his chair, speechless and deflated, looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him. His usual bravado had completely evaporated, leaving behind only the shell of someone who had been thoroughly and publicly defeated. "I hope this is a wake-up call," Johnson added, her voice now carrying a note of genuine hope rather than anger. "Not just for you, but for everyone in this industry who thinks that fame gives them permission to treat people as less than human." With that, she walked off the set with her head held high, leaving behind a studio full of stunned faces and an audience that erupted into thunderous applause. The cameras followed her until she disappeared behind the curtain, then slowly panned back, to show Kimmel still sitting motionless at his desk. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within hours, clips of the confrontation had millions of views across every social platform. Industry professionals, fellow celebrities, and viewers around the world praised Johnson for her courage in standing up to inappropriate treatment. Kimmel's ratings plummeted as sponsors began distancing themselves from the controversy. The incident became a watershed moment for late-night television, forcing a long-overdue conversation about the treatment of guests, particularly women, in entertainment media. Johnson's walkout didn't just end one uncomfortable interview. It sparked a movement toward greater respect and professionalism that would reshape the industry for years to come.